So, good afternoon. My name is Kemal Malik. I'm a member of the Board of Management for Bayer, responsible for innovation across the Bayer Group. As I was introduced, I'm a physician by training. It was interesting listening to Paul and talk about HIV. I practiced as a junior doctor in the early 90s in London, and particularly in West London. And I was seeing successive young men at that time predominantly who we were telling going to die within months. Now, in a relatively short period of time, because I'm not that old, we are now in a position where this is a chronic disease, and that is an amazing impact of what innovation can do for the world. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the pharma industry, but also talk about the power of innovation. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about trying new things and having the willingness to try new things. The pharma industry is a fantastic industry. I would say that. I'm a senior representative of the industry. But it's done some amazing things in terms of prolonging life. Paul's talked about HIV, but if you look at cardiovascular disease, antihypertensives, statins, drugs for heart failure, huge benefits have been conveyed by the pharmaceutical industry. And it's an industry that economically is very powerful. I mean, it's an industry of about $700 billion worldwide. So I guess everything's rosy. Well, not quite. There is a fundamental issue that the industry faces, and that is one, put very simply, that the cost of generating innovation currently on an amalgamated basis for the industry is less than the value we're getting back as an industry. If you look at the entire pharmaceutical industry, we spend about $150 billion a year on R&D. That's more than the GDP of Kuwait. And yet the returns we're getting back on an amalgamated basis are not compensating for the spend. Now, why is that a problem? The problem is simple. Our business model as a company, as an industry, is we get some innovation, we develop that innovation, we may or may not manufacture it, we commercialize it, we get returns, those go back to our shareholders, but also go back to fund further innovation. If we don't do that, the model breaks, and that's exactly what Paul talked about. The challenge being that if we don't do that, we've got a fundamental problem on maintaining our continuity as an industry. This was something that Goran was going to talk about yesterday. Unfortunately, he was ill, and I think it's something that the panel will take forward. I'm not going to go on at length about all the reasons why they are, but R&D productivity is a very simple thing. You have capital outlay, you spend money on your innovation and bring it to the market, and you get cash inflow. If either of those two go askew, you've got a problem. If bringing the innovation to the market costs more, and you're spending more and more, but the returns aren't coming in, you've got a bust model. And so, as an industry, we need to think about what does this mean for us? If you look at an issue that keeps CEOs, let alone heads of R&D, awake in the middle of the night, it's R&D productivity. Your future depends on R&D productivity. And that's why when Daniel and Felix invited me to this meeting, I was so delighted to come, because we are talking to the leaders of the future. I've got the privilege of talking to the leaders of the future. You will shape the future world. You have an amazing privilege because you've got fantastic education. When I read through those profiles, you are the brightest and the best. We're going to rely on you in the future to shape the world and have an impact. When I qualified in medicine, I phoned my father the day I qualified. Father was a very simple man, very decent man. I'm very close to him. I was very close to him before he died. And he left school at 15, never went to university, but his dream was that his children would get educated. So I phoned him up on the day I qualified and said, Dad, I've qualified. And he said one thing to me, he said, make a difference. And that is a message I would give to all of you. Use your education to make a difference, because you have the ability to. Speaking to some of the people last night, speaking to some of you over lunch, you have the ability to make a difference for mankind. The other stuff will follow. The trappings, the material trappings, the seniority, the leadership, that will follow if you have a purpose in life. Have a purpose to make a difference. So, as I said, there is a challenge in terms of R&D productivity. And when I got to the board about 2 or 3 years ago, I thought, what can we do about it? For 10 years, I'd been head of development in pharma. And we'd brought a lot of innovation to the market. One of the world's best-selling drugs, a drug called Xarelto, which we'd partnered with Paul and J&J. It's now one of the world's best-selling drugs, an antithrombotic. We brought a lot of other innovation to the market. And thought, well, what can we do to ensure that that innovation pool continues? And I was struck by 2 things. The first was that we are going through a revolution in biomedicine at the moment, driven by new technologies. And the second was, is there a different model for accessing innovation? We obviously have our in-house innovation. We spend about nearly $5 billion a year on R&D. We have collaborators. So we bring people in, like J&J. They use our labs. We don't charge them. And we can work with them if they so wish, but they don't have to work with us. But I want to think, well, is there a different model we can use to source innovation? And as I said, it was driven by the power, harnessing the great power of new technologies. And I really do believe that we're going through a third wave of innovation as a pharmaceutical industry. The first wave of innovation was the founding of the pharmaceutical industry. Merck in Darmstadt in Germany started synthesizing alkaloids in the sort of second half of the 19th century. About that time, Colonel Eli Lilly was fighting in the American Civil War, and Ernst Robinson Squibb started developing antiseptics and painkillers for people in the American Civil War. Beecham's in the UK set up the first pharmaceutical factory, and in 1897, a bioscientist synthesized aspirin. And that was the birth of the modern pharmaceutical industry. And most of the innovation we brought forward over the next 70 or 80 years was what's known as small molecule chemistry. It's based on chemistry done in labs. Then I guess the next big wave of innovation was in the 1980s. Genentech and Amgen, so-called large molecules, and by that I mean monoclonal antibodies, therapeutic proteins, DNA vaccines. And this was a new wave of innovation. 40% of the entire global pharmaceutical market now is large molecules. The wave of innovation we're going through now is the use of cell-based therapies as treatments and the ability to manipulate the human genome to eradicate disease. And that juxtaposition of amazing technology allied with, is there a different way of sourcing innovation, led me to set up something called BioLeaps. It was called Leaps. If any of you are from France, you'll see that's the famous staircase in Lyon. And skateboarders always wanted to jump over it. And they kept on failing, and they kept on failing, and they kept on failing. And then someday, someone succeeded. We've got a video of it. If you're ever interested, Google BioLeaps. And it's a story of how, in any endeavor in life, be prepared for a lot of failure, but then you will succeed. So I want to talk a little bit about the model and what we've done. So the idea was, can we harness 5 key technologies in the world? And the key technologies that we wanted to harness were induced pluripotent stem cells, DNA editing, the microbiome, RNA activation, and RNA inhibition. That was the major focus of this. But the model was slightly different. The first thing was we would focus only on breakthrough. And the reason why we wanted this is where we wanted amazing benefit for patients, something that Paul talked about. If you look at the kind of benefit that's being conveyed by things like CAR-T, if you see some of the gene therapy that's coming from Bluebird and Spark, we are getting efficacy that was unprecedented. So focusing on breakthrough technologies, A, has the most meaningful impact for society. So going back to what my father told me, making an impact. But the second thing is, there's a fast pathway to licensure. With the 21st Century Cares Act in the FDA, there is now a regenerative medicine designation. So the FDA is willing to work with us in many of these breakthrough areas. The second thing we want to do was have very substantial investments. It's so-called Series A. We were going to form new companies outside Bayer, but with very substantial investment. Typically, corporate venture is a small amount of funding for a period of time. We are far more committed to a large amount of investment, playing some really big, bold bets and seeing what happens. Active incubation, we allow these companies to flourish outside Bayer. And the other thing was agility in process. Bayer is a big organization. It's 100,000 people around the world. We have structure, we have process. Sometimes agility isn't our core strength. And one of the things we wanted to do was set up these companies outside and see if we could set them up and make them work quickly. So we've set up 3 companies. I'm going to talk about those very quickly. The first company we set up is Blue Rock Therapeutics. This is a company that's looking at, in essence, programming cells to treat Parkinson's disease and heart failure. We know for a long time that if you inject fetal cells, you can have a benefit in Parkinson's disease. But there are some challenges, obviously, with using fetal cells. Based on the seminal work from John Gordon and Shinya Yamanaka, for which they won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2012, we're looking at the potential of induced pluripotent stem cells to treat Parkinson's disease and also heart failure. Lorenz Duda from Memorial Sloan Kettering has developed, I guess, the standard protocol for the differentiation of stem cells into dopaminergic neurons. We set up this company in 2016. We signed the deal, and we've invested $225 million over 4 years. That is one of the largest Series A investments, startup investments, ever done in the industry. And the reason why we're doing it is for 2 reasons. One, we believe in the science. And second, it'll have an amazing impact. When I brought this forward to the CEO, he asked me, will it work? I said, probably not. It's incredibly high risk. He said, okay. Will we make money? I said, I don't know. He said, okay. But I said, it'll make a difference if it does. He said, okay, let's do it. So we've set this up. If any of you read Nature Biotech, this month's edition of Nature Biotech has described this as one of the top 30 world-changing companies, something obviously we're very pleased with. We aim to have an IND, so a start of clinical trials, this year. So the company was set up in June 2016, and we're entering clinical trials in Parkinson's disease using stem cells this year. Shows you, and these people, they have, you know, if you go to any of the offices that I'm sure Bayer has, and probably J&J, they're pretty nice. You go to the offices of these people, they've taken Paul's message on heart. There's no infrastructure at all. They're focusing on the science. And this could be, I think, have a huge impact, incredibly high risk, but Bayer's willing to make a bold bet. The second one I want to talk to you about is a company called CRISPR Therapeutics that we've set up with CRISPR Therapeutics. Many of you know about CRISPR-Cas. It's a particular type of gene editing tool. Emmanuel Charpentier was one of the key scientists who elucidated the role of CRISPR-Cas as a genome editing tool. And in essence, you look at DNA sequences that are implicated in disease, look to splice those out. As I said, we've invested $300 million over 5 years. This is probably the biggest Series A investment ever made. I had the same discussion with the CEO at the time. Will it make money? Is it high risk? Yes, yes, maybe not, maybe not. Well, I don't know, but it could make a difference. I think genuinely, this is a revolutionary technology. And it has the ability to fundamentally change. I don't often talk about cure, because from a regulatory point of view, cure is a very difficult concept because it's forever. And when it's interesting, when you talk to FDA, amongst others, they can say, well, how can we define what cure is? In some conditions, you can see there is no burden, you know, viral load or whatever. But in some other conditions, are we just going to follow these people forever if you've got Parkinson's disease or whatever? So I talk about long-term benefit. And now we're going to have to think about how we follow these patients up after clinical trials. Here we're aiming for an IND, a start in 2019 for clinical trials. CRISPR Therapeutics is starting clinical trials this year in beta thalassemia. That'll be the first trial done with CRISPR-Cas, I think, in the West. In China, there are already 8 or 9 studies underway with CRISPR-Cas. Then the other initiative we've set up is utilizing the power of the microbiome. As you know, we're all colonized by bacteria. We have more bacterial cells than we have human cells. just like there's a major initiative at NIH known as the Human Microbiome Project, rather like the Human Genome Project. Plants are colonized by bacteria, and these bacteria can do good things. They can enhance nitrogen fixation, they can help the plants grow in times of stress, and our opportunity here is to work with a company called Ginkgo Holdings. This is a spin-out of MIT, and they've got a proprietary synthetic biology platform looking at engineering microbes, and we're partnering with them on the ag side. The aim here is to reduce the use of artificial fertilizers. 12% of all greenhouse gases in the world are as a consequence of using fertilizers. So if you can enhance plants and their ability to fixate nitrogen, you can reduce the load, and part of our commitment to sustainable agriculture. So that's a little bit about what we're doing. We've invested $500 million over 4 or 5 years in these 3 initiatives. They are incredibly high risk. They're bold bets. But to date, we've surprised ourselves with the progress that has been made. And so our intent and endeavor is to take this forward. People often ask me, well, is this just corporate venturing? No. If you look at classical corporate venturing, it's about playing a portfolio diversification game. You have multiple companies and you invest a little bit in each. We're breaking all the rules. We're investing $500 million in 3 companies, the largest Series A fundings known. Incredibly bold bets, incredibly high risk. The reality is it may not work. But unless you try something, you'll never learn how to get it better next time and the time again and the time again. The other thing is it gives the management's breathing time. Venture capital is incredibly useful. Last year alone, $16 billion was invested in venture capital into biotech, and 1/3 of that was in startups. There is a trend for larger investments being made into companies. Rather than spreading money across multiple companies, larger amounts being put in companies. But the trouble with venture capital, according to their model, is that you invest, you look for a flexion point, and then you exercise your option to make money. You're not in it for the long term. In areas where there is a lot of failure, that's a challenge for the management teams. And that's why we're committed for 3 or 4 years for things like Casebia, Blue Rock. We've invested a lot of money, allow the management teams, and we have trust in the management teams. We've got board seats, to allow them to develop the technology without having the sword of Damocles hanging over them, thinking the funding is going to be cut because they're not making progress. So that's a little bit about our opportunity to try and address the challenge of R&D productivity. The experiment, if you can call $500 million an experiment, has worked well, so we want to advance it. We're going to scale up very significantly in terms of the investment. We're going to do 2 other things. All of these 3 companies are based in Boston. If any of you go to Boston, you probably realize why. It is the biomedical hub of the world. But we said at the start that the BioLeaps initiative was going to be Berlin, Boston, Beijing. And we really want to look at those countries. We will obviously Germany because we're Bayer, but also the opportunity of innovation in Beijing. The other big advance we're going to look at is that juxtaposition between digital and biotech. If someone can crack the triumvirate of looking at patients' genotype, looking at their phenotype, how you express the disease, and following them longitudinally with things like electronic medical records, and bringing that together, we'll learn an awful lot about disease. If you see what Roche have done, where they've just purchased Flatiron, which is in essence an electronic medical records company, you're bringing together a lot of information about a patient and then accessing large amounts of data outside and bring that together. We're probably going to do something in that space as well. So that's what I want to talk about. It's a little bit of an experiment within Bayer. We feel it's gone very well. Will it work? Who knows, but it's worth trying. Thank you very much. So, has anyone any questions?
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. My name is Pedro. I'm a PhD student here, and my research is in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And I want to ask a question on what you finished on, actually, which is the idea of sharing data, not only across companies, but with clinical trials and such. So there's been quite a bit of talk lately and hype around the blockchain framework. And it's a technology that still will take a long time to mature. But I'd love to know if there's any works that are going on or any initial projects that your company is involved in, and how that's going to turn out in terms of how companies share data among themselves, right, between Bayer, Johnson & Johnson, and such others, how you share data with the patient, because then the patient becomes the one who's in control of the clinical trials data, and how the anonymity plays into all of this. So yeah, I'd love to know if you have any thoughts.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, obviously, we run large amounts of clinical trial data before we get drugs approved. Xarelto, the drug that J&J and Bayer worked on, 60,000 patients were studied in clinical trials before we got approval in our major indication, which is stroke prevention, atrial fibrillation. But increasingly, the power is coming from real-world evidence, where you're capturing data of the drugs in usage. Now, that's a privilege because people are sharing their data with you. And they need to feel confident that they are protected as individuals. You're hearing all the stuff that's going on in congressional hearings about tech companies at the moment, without me mentioning them. And there is an issue about confidentiality. It's a big, big issue in Germany, where for historical reasons, there is an issue of patient confidentiality. Blockchain provides an opportunity for people to share data with confidence about the confidentiality of the information, and it allows us to share data amongst companies. Because the thing I didn't mention is Big Pharma has the opportunity to federate IP from multiple sources. If you look at some of the companies I talked about, they'll be working together. Because if you're a stem cell company, you probably need to have some opportunity for gene editing as well to optimize the stem cell. If you look at Gilead, they paid a lot of money to buy Kite, but they then bought Sangamo, which is a zinc-fingered editing company. So large companies will increasingly federate IP to the benefit of outcomes for patients. So blockchain has the opportunity to protect individuals who are sharing their data with companies or governments, but also protect companies in the IP chain.
Hi, my name is Jessica.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm in an ALS lab, so it sounds kind of similar.
Where?
Johns Hopkins.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you know anyone, maybe we can talk. But so my question was in terms of thinking of innovation, right? So a lot of us are students here, and we're told to think very specifically about certain proteins, whereas you go into the industry space and it's about therapeutics. So how do you personally versus Bayer as a company, how do you think of innovation in terms of understanding fundamental principles of biology versus going straight into knowing what's out there and trying to tackle that, if that makes sense?
Thank you. You need to have deep domain expertise as a company to make informed decisions. That expertise may reside in your company, but also you can access it from outside. So collaborations with the great and the good, and you're one of the leading medical institutions in the world. So it always comes down, for me, the definition of innovation I use. People often ask me, what's the definition of innovation as far as Bayer's concerned? And it's very simple. Innovation is something new, because it also has a concept of newness, innovation, that is meaningful for the patient. And it has to have both. Bayer as a company isn't a university. We're a commercial organization. So whatever we produce as innovation has to have a benefit for the end user. And that is an important responsibility because we're spending an awful lot of money. So whatever innovation we generate has to have a benefit for the patient. So we need people who have deep, deep, deep domain knowledge, right down to the molecular level. Okay? But we also need to understand how can you translate that to something with a patient with cancer, or a patient with HIV, or a patient with Parkinson's disease. to actually meaningfully impact their outcomes. And that's what it comes down to.
My name's Viva. I work with Pfizer in Dublin.
Okay.
You mentioned the microbiome. I was just wondering, is there much work being done on the gut-brain axis and harnessing the microbiome for the future?
Sorry, Ian?
Are you doing much work on like the gut-brain axis and harnessing the microbiome?
We only have the IP. I mean, the world is driven by IP, and as you go out there, that'll be the reality. We have the IP around ag uses, so we're not involved in human uses at the moment.
One question is, hi Max,
Hi.
for Hong Kong and also US. The question is, when you think about these type of ventures taking these big bets, like what are the decision criteria you would choose to be able to decide to go in on one particular venture? And of the areas where you've sort of seen, I'm sure you've seen many different types of deals. How did you craft these three particular deals?
Okay. You almost work backwards and say, does the technology have the ability to convey meaningful benefits? That's the first thing you ask yourself. If it worked, could you really have meaningful benefits? Now, if this stuff works, you could cure hematological conditions in children. Can you imagine the power of doing that? Kids with awful diseases, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, thalassemias, you could cure them. If this works, people who have got Parkinson's disease with rigidity, akinesia, tremor, could lead lives that are without that. So if the technology has the power to influence and have major impact, that's a starting point. The second thing, quite frankly, is do you believe in the science? Do you believe the rationale behind the science? And the third thing is, do you believe in the people? I was speaking to one of the major tech companies about their innovation process. I said, how do you decide where you invest? And it was, do we trust the people? And unfortunately, that's what it comes down to, fortunately and unfortunately. Do I trust these people to be able to deliver? And that's part of leadership in a large organization. As I said, Bayer has 100,000 people. Do I trust the people to deliver? Do I believe in the science, and will it make an impact?
Hi, thank you. Your talk was very interesting. My name is Rohan. I'm from the United States.
Where in the US?
Princeton University.
Okay.
And so, given the very capital-intensive nature of biotech, as you have described here, $500 million in investments, how can young people like everybody in this room, who kind of don't have the years and years of experience, get involved in entrepreneurship and being part of Leaps by Bayer and things like that?
I talked about Leaps by Bayer because these are the really big investments. What we also do is something called Grants for Impact, where if someone's got a great idea, we're prepared to give them some money. You don't have to share IP with us. You can keep the IP. You work on it by yourselves. So we have a program. We've got two programs. We have collaborators where you can come in and use our lab space either in Berlin or in San Francisco, and we have startups that come because you don't want startups wasting money on labs. You should waste your time, effort, and all of those things on science. So we allow you to use our labs, and you also get mentored by our scientists if you're interested. We also do something called Grants for Impact, which is, if you've got a great idea, we will give you some funding. Once again, without any conditions, we don't expect IP. You can then go off and sign a deal with J&J, we don't mind. But that's another initiative, and that is probably a more broadly. These are the big, bold bets. We're not going to do these 100 times, but we do make major investments of meaningful level for startup companies.
So I'm Mohammed from Boston, and since we are living in this era of cell-based therapies, has the industry or even governments started to think rigorously about how we're going to regulate the ultimate generic versions of these therapies, particularly in regard to especially manufacture and quality control metrics that will deviate from like, the small molecule industry?
Am I allowed to answer because my time is up? Okay, quickly, two things. First of all, we truly welcome the regulation from FDA. If you're going to do these things properly, as we are, and we're a responsible company, and Blue Rock's a responsible company, you want regulation to take the cowboys out of the system. So we truly want regulation, 21st Century Care Act. And final, answer very quickly. I was on a venture capital board in Boston, and someone said, where would you put your money as far as these new technologies are concerned? And I said, simple, someone who works out manufacturing and delivery for new technologies, because that's going to be the key issue. This stuff will work. We need to be able to produce it at scale, and we need to get it where it needs to be. Thank you.